I'm Julie Yovi, and I'm the architecture critic for the Wall Street Journal, and it seems wonderfully appropriate to start this day looking at Landmarks Law to get a sense of the landscape and the lay of the land before there was any landscape law at all. And to talk about this, we have Otis Purcell, who I hope needs not much of an introduction because I don't have his whole bio on me, but he is a very distinguished lawyer who was in the trenches before there was any Landmarks Law at all, and spent 7 years getting Brooklyn Heights a designation for the Landmarks District, the first in the country, and has called himself a do-it-yourself preservationist. He was flying blind, in a sense, and I'm hoping he'll describe for us what it was like in those days before there was really anything at all. In my own little research, in the mid-50s, there were numerous organizations with these tantalizing names, such as American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, or the AIA's Joint Committee on Design Control, that was charmingly dedicated to prevent ugliness, was its mandate. And a lot of that was born out of the city, beautiful movement of the 1890s, and also to fight the plague of billboards, which we don't remember. We see it in movies sometimes. They covered the city. But in an email, Otis told me that really those organizations had no feet on the ground, that they were silent and invisible throughout his own 7-year fight to work on the Brooklyn Heights designation. So I'm wondering, Otis, why don't you set the scene for us a little bit and say, who existed, what was the sense of where you could turn in trying to get attention for your buildings?
Well, there really wasn't a lot of opportunity to turn in any direction. Besides, we were all just kids. We didn't even know how to turn in any particular direction. Basically, there was a little group that began to arrive in Brooklyn Heights in the mid-50s. Up until that time, the Heights had been something of a place of decline. But young people began to move in, and they were attracted, I think, by mostly aesthetic considerations, although also economic considerations, and they fell in love with the beauty of Brooklyn Heights. And then suddenly they discovered that they were threatened, that whole way of life that they had bought into was threatened by all kinds of forces. Borough President Cashmore was intent upon a grand civic center. Bob Moses was intent upon urban renewal, cutting out a big slice of the Heights. The Jehovah's Witnesses wanted to go right through the middle of the Heights, gouging, and there were commercial developers who were also. And so suddenly, this little group of young people who didn't know anything, I mean, literally, I was 26. I was a lawyer, I was an associate in a law firm trying to make good. And there wasn't really a lot of expertise. At the beginning, we realized we needed to reach out for some help. So we went to the National Trust. I knew about the National Trust. I also knew about Beacon Hill. For some reason, I don't even remember how it was I knew about Beacon Hill. But the National Trust sent a packet of material to me that happened to include the Bard Law. Nobody had said anything about the Bard Law. Bard Law, what on earth was the Bard Law? There was this one page that had this one paragraph on it, tucked in among various other things that I got from the National Trust. And that was the moment. That changed everything. In the Heights, we had a Heights Association. They were doing nothing about the problem. This was a young group that got together and formed its own group. But once this magical Bard Law appeared on the scene, everybody saw at once the potential. And we reached out to the Municipal Art Society. We wanted their psychological support. But it turned out that within ready grasp in the Heights, we had all the expertise we needed. We had a leading zoning lawyer, Arden Rathkoff, who'd written a treatise on the subject, knew about these aesthetic things that were elsewhere in the country. We had an architectural historian, Clay Lancaster. All we had to do was to find some of these people, and we were off and running. And we got off the starting block very, very quickly, entirely self-sufficiently, because there really wasn't any special expertise we could turn to. We had to do it ourselves. We were inventing, basically, the Landmarks Law for New York City. And there wasn't any, there was no track. We were just doing it from scratch. So the two, I would say that you ask all these wonderful institutions that you speak of, they were out there. We didn't know they existed, and they didn't know we existed. They didn't seem to care that we existed. We did it on our own, but we did a whole lot of different things. We created a statute. By April of '59, we had our own statute that we presented to James Felt for inclusion in the zoning resolution. We didn't succeed in getting him to do it, but it was the beginning.
Felt's focus at that moment was the zoning resolution and the reform of that. And so in effect, that stalled what you were able to do for a number of years. How did your group feel about that at the moment? And how did you go about protecting, it was about 3 or 4 years that zoning took precedence to any formation of a landmarks law, a serious approach to landmarks law. What did you do in that interim?
Well, we never stopped moving. Our little legs were churning. We, in that period of time, learned about every building in Brooklyn Heights. With the help of Clay Lancaster, we learned the styles, the dates. We became educated in architectural history, which we knew nothing about before that. We created a real revolution in the Heights. Everybody got excited about this. It was surprising how it spread like wildfire. Everybody got very interested in Greek revival and federal. These are things nobody ever thought of before. So we had coffee clutches. Clay gave lectures. There were articles in the paper. We spread ourselves all around the Heights. We tried to figure out whether this idea of a centralized preservation commission was a good idea. Arden Rathkoff, who had a lot of experience, thought that it was unrealistic to think that we could do anything other than through a city mechanism. I thought that by just having a Brooklyn Heights Historic District, like the Beacon Hill Historic District, we would present a very narrow profile and avoid some of the political entanglements that we knew were waiting for us out there. And there was a lot of time spent trying to figure out what the correct psychology, and also we reached out to other people in the city. We met people in Greenwich Village. And
what stage were they at when you were?
They were always, well, they had a major focus on Washington Square. And a lot of their activities centered on various threats that Bob Moses presented and others presented to Washington Square. They really didn't develop a broad preservation program as quickly as we did. Maybe because we were brand new at it, we moved more quickly. They were sort of steeped in preservation, and for that reason were a little bit slower off the mark. They always seemed to want to find out what we were doing. What we were doing was trying to generate a statute of our own. And we did. We generated a statute of our own. We created a report on all of the architectural history that Brooklyn Heights presented. We created a grassroots movement. There was a lot of activity going on, and we had a little internecine battle with when the mayor set up the initial committee to consider structures of, what is it? It was a wonderful name.
Yeah,
Structures of
here.
historic and aesthetic importance, or something like that.
Committee for Preservation of Structures of Historic and Aesthetic Importance.
Well, James
But
Felt...
that was toothless, right? I mean, it had no authority.
No, it didn't. James Felt was the name of the game. He got the mayor to set that up. That was in June of '61. And Felt tried to divert us to his committee. We didn't want to be diverted to his committee. We just wanted to get to be an historic district and let it go at that. But no, we were sort of herded into that, and we fought against that. We tried to go our own way.
What was supposed to be the point of that committee?
The committee was supposed to be a prelude to something more. And it wasn't very long before, actually, that April '62, buffeted by the Penn Station issue, the mayor created the Landmarks Preservation Commission. But it was without any power. It was just the same committee by a different name. Actually, the personnel did change. And they did set to work. They had a executive director, a wonderful person by the name of Jim Vanderpool, who had been the Avery librarian at Columbia, taught architecture and architectural history at Columbia, was a highly respected person. And the commission, although it had no power, did get off the mark. And because our main job at that point became making a lot of noise. We made a lot of noise. The Municipal Art Society had wonderful relationships with James Felt and with others, but he was the key. And what we did was bang drums and created chaos and generally insisted that we be an historic district as quickly as possible. And we created credibility for Jeffrey Platt and Harmon Goldstone, who were the two leaders of the band.
Were newspapers always on your side? Did they immediately cover everything you did, and what role did they play?
Interestingly, the newspapers were immediately on our side. Our local press was very, very important. It got the idea. It was tremendously supportive all the way along, and it didn't take any time at all before the New York Times jumped on the bandwagon. Eventually, Ada Louise Huxtable behind the scenes and then more overtly became a great supporter. So the media was extremely helpful to us, but then also to the Jeffrey Platt Harmon Goldstone Committee, and gave that credibility. And eventually, even the turgid response of city government couldn't resist any longer. But that's a long story, and if all of you have not read Tony Wood's Preserving New York book, the whole story on every level is beautifully portrayed there, and it really the whole pre-1965 history is laid out eloquently and in detail.
Why do you think in 61, when that committee was formed and it didn't really have any authority, why not? Who were they afraid of? And I've also, in terms of Penn Station, there was a sense that if there was too much noise made about landmarks, about the historic districts, it might slow down the formation of a law. And then in a sense, the Penn Station was almost sacrificed to allow the law to come into being later. Is there any sense of why there was a tendency not to be aggressive at the beginning?
Well, there was.
You were, but I think the rest of the.
No, we were not quiet. But I think the answer is that nobody was very sure about where legally preservation stood. We hadn't had the Grand Central case, obviously, yet. We knew that there were a lot of landmarks laws strewn throughout cities across the country.
Mostly about zoning, if I understand. I mean, they were
Well, no,
historic
there were many historic districts. I mean, like Beacon Hill, I give you as an example. There was Charleston, there was Georgetown, there was the Vieux Carré in New Orleans. We learned about these things. But I think that the basic problem was a lack of security because it was not a political group. It didn't have its own constituency. It depended entirely on the whim of A, James Felt, and B, ultimately the mayor, who was quite a distant figure. I never had anything at all to do with the mayor. The only reach to the mayor was through James Felt. I think there was a fear that too rambunctious an approach could stem the whole thing at the very outset. And I must say that that same worry that there was not a strong foundation, either politically or legally, caused the Landmarks Commission at the outset itself, after the law was passed, to be really a wee timid beastie. It was just a very, they proceeded very cautiously, let's put it that way. But I think beyond that, there wasn't really, when you consider that there was no political powerhouse behind that committee, it accomplished a lot. And then the Landmarks Commission before the law accomplished still more. And what is really important and what is really interesting is how much they did accomplish without a political base.
And the argument the idea continues today that maybe landmarks should be a subset of zoning. And I know at one point it was literally considered that that zoning could take care of all landmarks issues. What was your sense then of the importance of separating those out, or, was it a possibility that yes, zoning could handle?
We were so single-mindedly focused on getting ourselves under whatever rubric identified as an historic district that those issues were not of great importance to us. Our original statute, which we created in April of 1959 for the purpose of presenting to James Felt at his spring '59 hearings on the zoning resolution, actually was going to be an amendment to the zoning resolution, and it would have placed the whole shooting match under the jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. When I drafted a standalone, later on, when I drafted a standalone Brooklyn Heights ordinance, I had in mind that there would be a separate commission, but it would be under we needed an administrative body to be attached to. I attached it to the building department at that time. Nobody cared particularly about the long-run view of how it would ultimately work. What we were trying to do was get protected and get protected as quickly as we could, because every year that went by, we were losing buildings, and we were in a beggars can't be choosers position. Whatever we could accomplish was going to be fine. Ultimately, we then became more sophisticated and clearly felt that a Landmarks Commission should be a standalone, independent body, because, the considerations involved in zoning are actually very different from landmarks. I mean, you can say that they're related because they are. Obviously, they're related, but they're very different. And to have subjected the Landmarks Commission to the jurisdiction of the City Planning Commission would, I think, have been a terrible mistake, and would be a mistake today. But we were not focusing at the beginning on such issues.
In fact, when you were designated, you almost immediately discovered some gaps in the historic designation. Can you speak to those about height and even nonprofits? How did you come to realize those?
Yeah, well, the Landmarks Law has a provision that scared us at the beginning, that basically gave to zoning and the City Planning Commission jurisdiction over height. And so the Landmarks Commission explicitly in the law is not supposed to regulate height. Now, they in fact, and at the beginning, we didn't have any idea whether the appropriateness standard was going to work to limit height in a low-scale community such as Brooklyn Heights. So we, very shortly after the Landmarks Law, went about getting ourselves a limited height district. We first of all got an amendment to the zoning resolution providing for limited height districts in historic districts. We became the first limited height district. It was not an idea that appealed in the long run to the City Planning Commission. There have not been a lot of limited height districts, but we were worried that that limitation on the Commission's jurisdiction over height could be a real problem. Because basically, the height issue is entirely within the discretion of these commissioners. Are they going to feel that a taller building amidst a low-scale group of buildings is inappropriate? The appropriateness standard is pretty flexible and it's discretionary. And as it has turned out, for the most part, it's worked very well.
You even hoped that it would bring down general heights by the replacement of buildings and then coming up to, did that actually happen as you had hoped at the time?
Well, no.
Bluntly.
There have not been very many challenges to the our 50-foot limited height district. The principal one was the Hotel Margaret. Hotel Margaret was a perfect case in point. The City Planning Commission report on the limited height district rule expressly said, you know, there are going to be explosions, there are going to be fires, and this 50-foot limited height district thing is going to, over time, bring everything back to its original scale. Well, that's not at all what happened. The Hotel Margaret burned down, and there was litigation and so forth and so on, and the net result was that a new building of equal height to the original Hotel Margaret was constructed. So, you know, but that was really an exceptional situation. The 50-foot limited height district for Brooklyn Heights has made a great deal of sense and is responsible, I think, for holding back a lot of the development pressure that might otherwise have existed.
How much of a trigger was Robert Moses with the Cadman Plaza redevelopment plan? Would you say that, you know, galvanized you initially, or were you already underway when that happened?
Our little organization, which we initially started, had two pieces to it. One was fighting Bob Moses on Cadman Plaza. I think the jury is still out as to whether that leg of the effort was successful. I led the part having to do with creating historic preservation. And the fact that Moses was out there looming was a definite reason why we proceeded, but there were lots of things. Individual buildings were being picked off. The Brooklyn Savings Bank building, the Brooklyn Mercantile Library building. There are many buildings that were being picked off as a result of a relationship between commercial real estate interests and local government, evidenced through the development of the Civic Center. And we were losing things as the result, not just of Bob Moses, but Bob Moses represented a huge threat. He ultimately did succeed in taking down 5 entire blocks that were filled with Greek Revival buildings and other buildings of note.
Which he called slums.
What's that?
Which he called slums.
Yeah, well, he thought they were slums. In Willowtown, which maybe some people know, which is absolutely one of the most charming parts of Brooklyn Heights, he also was focused on, and while he was fended off at first, he thought maybe he would come back and have another swipe at it. Fortunately, he didn't get it. He was sort of unhorsed before he got to that point. He was a definite factor in stimulating our energy.
Now, you've called yourself a do-it-yourself preservationist, and for many, preservation began as a bit of a white shoe operation, the Municipal Art Society. How did the two of you work together? You know, were you at odds at ever, or was it easy to join forces?
They may very well have been sort of white shoe. MAS back in that period was somewhat clubby. We were anything but white shoe. The group that arrived in Brooklyn Heights in the mid-50s were architects, all kinds of, we were a real mix of people. And they were anything but white shoe. But we had no difficulty at all talking with nice white shoe people from MAS. They were perfectly nice to us. And Alan Burnham he was appointed by MAS to try to give us a hand with a little committee. Henry Hope Reed was a member of that committee, perfectly splendid fellow, and indeed Albert Bard, who was then 92 years old, actually came over to our initial meeting. Quite a remarkable, spry guy. I think he died at maybe 96, but at 92, he was still going strong.
He'd been working on this aesthetic regulation for something like 40 years.
Well, he was the Bard of the Bard Law.
Yes.
And he saw in us, and with our naivete, possibly the route to an actual landmarks law in New York City. So he was very encouraging of our enthusiasm, and that was very helpful psychologically to us. These great people were prepared to think that we weren't crazy.
As a final question, I was wondering, I think your language for your regulation, some of it actually wound up in the landmarks law.
Well, I've never tried to make that kind of a comparison, but if you take the ordinance, it was going to be an amendment to the zoning resolution that we produced in April of '59. It's structured the same way. I mean, I don't know, I really don't know whether the drafters of the actual landmarks law looked very deeply at it. But you know, Bill Fisher, who was one of our little group, became a member of the commission, and he was steeped in what our history had been. And I have no doubt that he would have tried to bring to bear on the creation of the landmarks law the learning and experience that we had had in drafting our own statute.
Well, thank you, Otis. I know that landmarks is very much about individual buildings, but obviously it's also about singular people such as yourself who went into the trenches to make it all happen. Thank you.